I think it's fair to start off with the biggest news of this week, which was Shyam Sankar's essentially 30-minute interview that he did with Morgan Stanley. This was an interview with the analyst that put the price to $16. I believe he downgraded from 24 to 16, but upgraded it from underweight to overweight, something along those lines. And there were a lot of questions that were asked, a lot of answers that were given. I think this interview was in some ways better than Alex Karp's interview at Stanford, just based on the level of detail. So we want to analyze that. So Sachin, I'll start off with you. I think we'll start off with first the governmental business, because that's the big thing here. What were the things you heard come from Shyam's mouth around the governmental business, and how did you think it impacted your perspective on Palantir?
So I think the most important part that Shyam mentioned in the government business is like how about the lumpiness part, which we have discussed. That he said that practically what we are seeing is that there are 3 to 4 months window where all the contracts are being assigned. So you don't expect it to be like quite a smooth business. That was first. The second thing I think he mentioned and kind of didn't got a lot of traction is he said that they are working very close with government on this crisis and everything else they are doing. Okay, we also saw what happened on the constellation side, what happened, what Russia was trying with SpaceX and things like that. So he was very clear that they are preferred partners with government, and they expect this business to grow. And there is no reason, there should be any concern. Of course, it will not happen like what is happening in commercial picking steadily, because it's more strategic in nature. Okay. Also, they started government business earlier. So technically, they are already, in terms of reach to customers, they are already 80-90% there. So what they need to do more is to increase the penetration in customers, helping them more. All the governments are going to spend more on cybersecurity, in terms of AI, in terms of how the data is used. And with all this, like, sanctions are coming up. We saw what happened with Russia-Ukraine crisis, the sanction. These are like compliance things. So banks will be exposed, companies will be exposed. So you need softwares, and you need software today. It's not like you're going 6 months to build something. You might end up with a fine of $500 million. So I think it's in a macro sense, that's pretty solid, and that's pretty much what Shyam kind of summarized as well. Over to you, Kris.
Yeah, I think that Shyam did an amazing job of describing the partnerships that they're trying to develop with the governments in Europe. A lot of the governments had, I don't want to say an adversarial role, but they had somewhat of an adversarial role because of local politics in not adopting Palantir a little bit more readily. Now that the shit's hit the fan, they've pretty much had to kind of rely on Palantir, because Palantir is one of the few companies that actually has forward deployed engineers that are willing to go into crisis zones and make a difference, right? That is their culture. That it takes time to build that kind of culture and get employees that are willing to do that kind of work. So Palantir is way ahead of a lot of people. The other thing that I found that was awesome that he said was, we're not waiting around for them to pay us before we start helping them. A lot of people, especially if you worked in the government side, that the bureaucratic nature of getting financing to get any project done is really difficult, right? Because it's just a bureaucratic nature and the processes that have to go through just to get something done. So Palantir right now realized that, put together everything at Palantir's cost, and that's why it's important for Palantir to have that $2.5 billion nest egg, so that they can work on things without having to burn, without having to literally wait on, how do I say, pretty much do work without that cash coming in right away, right? It gives you that flexibility to operate. The other thing, and it's very important, is that now Europe is starting to act almost like interconnected military that they were supposed to do way before this, right? The goal was to be more interconnected. Right now, this crisis isn't affecting one country or two or three. It's affecting all of Europe. So how does that play into Palantir's hands, right? It ends up seeing that Palantir is one of the few companies that can actually take all this data from all these different sources and combine them together and make a unified map where all the allies can share that data together and actually make the difference in realizing value. So right now, all these countries that may have had I don't want to say a negative opinion of Palantir, but an indifferent opinion of Palantir, now they realize that, hey, you know what? This guy with the crazy hair was absolutely right. We need them more than we thought we did. So I think it was great. I like the fact that they focused on that. One of the things is during times of crisis, you've got companies that are like backing away. They're not trying to do more. Palantir is like, no, crisis is where we do our best. So let's get in there. Let's get it done. And it just goes to show that even during like the Afghan evacuation crisis, which company stood up and worked with the U.S. government to get all these people vetted and out of the country in like the shortest period of time? They called in Palantir. These guys literally took a train from New York Gotham headquarters to Washington, D.C., and were coding applications on the fly. So I think the true value of Palantir, just like Alex Karp says, it comes during times of crisis, and this is a time of crisis, so let's see what happens.
When was when they left to go to Washington for what mission?
Literally during the evacuation, when the Taliban were coming into Kabul, they were struggling. They're like, how are we going to evacuate one U.S. personnel, but then all of our allies that had been fighting with us, right? Like our Afghan partners there, because some of them were on kill lists. So how do you get them to the U.S.? It's a huge undertaking logistically. Well, guess what? Palantir ended up sending its engineers to D.C., working with the State Department and all the interconnected agencies to get vetting done live while these people are being transported out. Because the last thing you want is a terrorist getting into the country via an evacuation, right? So it's not just to say like, hey, let's take anyone and everybody and bring them to the US and evacuate them. It's like people who have helped us, right? So how do you know people who have helped us? They have to have documentation. They're included in certain databases, in contractor databases, right? Because a lot of the people that we had in Afghanistan on base, they were hired via contractors. The government doesn't hire people. The government hires a contractor. The contractor hires the locals, right? So all the paperwork, all the HR stuff was not with the US government. It was with all these other companies. Sometimes the government had dossiers on people and information on people, but at the end of the day, all that stuff had to be taken, put into just a giant ball of information, and then cast it and give it to the State Department, so the State Department can say, yes, 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 you're allowed, you're allowed, you're allowed. No, you're not allowed, you're not allowed. So almost, and think about it, they had to do that on the fly. I'll send you the article later. We can review it on one of our videos in the future, actually. Very cool operation. I'll tell you what it's called if you want to look it up.
Yeah. I had two thoughts about what he said about the government. Number one was this idea of so the federal government just passed 1.5 trillion in spending. About, I think, 700 billion is for defense, if I'm not wrong on that. He said that has to be spent by July. He says it's a yearly budget. By September is when it must be spent, but you can't spend it by September because you have to have these contracts done by July. So his wording was that creates volatility on the upside, and that Palantir should be able to participate in that volatility on the upside. Now, we're not going to see the results of all the deals they get likely until Q1 2023, maybe Q4 2022. But that level of volatility, given increased spending, given Germany puts $100 billion more into spending, 2% of their GDP, given what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, like it would seem weird if Palantir doesn't benefit from everything that's going on, especially given this Alex Karp shareholder letter. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It seems like they are prime to really go for the government, which begs the question, and I think this is the next logical transition, on Cathie Wood. I mean, Cathie Wood's thesis was that she sold because there's de-accelerating governmental growth. What Sham was talking about, becoming the software prime for the government, which is like the established contractor that then has subcontractors under them, but they're the ones that get the big money. It seems like that thesis is incorrect. So are us three guys on a podcast with 30, 40 people watching, are we correct? And is Cathie wrong on this governmental question?
See, I would say that the answer of that only time will tell. It is very clear that we are in different opinion than Cathie. There are a few things like, see, I made it very clear that when Cathie sold in a $10 to $11 range, by Cathie's own fund mandate and how she calculates the value, she's saying that Palantir should not exceed the market cap of 36 billion by February 2027. Okay, if that happens, I mean, it doesn't matter what any one of us say or what Palantir does, Cathie will be right. But if Palantir exceeds 36 billion, and if it exceeds significantly above 36 billion, yeah, even if they lose government business or they are not the prime commercial player, Kathy will still be wrong. Because at the end of the day, she's running a quantitative fund. So the opinion only matters in the numbers context. So I think the idea is very simple. February 2027, Palantir market cap is significantly above 36 billion. Kathy is wrong. If value is below that, we are wrong. I think it's a straightforward decision for me to judge, and we have 5 years timeline. I think one thing which I kind of reflected back and I realized that nobody's talking is, see, Palantir consistently claim to tackle and solve the world's biggest problem. Okay, a lot of companies actually don't. I mean, a lot of companies you go, they say, oh, we can do infinite scaling of your cloud capabilities. We can provide you cost efficiency. We can provide you security. We can provide you cutting edge AI. A lot of companies actually don't claim that they are solving the world's biggest problem. And this is to me something which is, and we don't have to take anyone's word for it. We can see what Skywaz is doing. I mean, it is fair to say that the work that the US government, CIA, and the Defense Department does, it's a cutting edge in its own. So actually, a lot of companies are not claiming the same thing because they know they cannot deliver it. And that is where the government business context is very important, because we saw, and Kris and I shared it earlier, there was an article where Palantir and Raytheon were selected to provide the prototype for the same contract. And Raytheon is working with like 8 different companies. Now, if you are the Raytheon and your partner is C3AI, which is literally a $2 billion market cap, I mean, you can make C3AI dance on your tune whichever you like, because they are not partner in equal sense. Okay, they are not. So that is what is different. Like when Palantir is partnering with government, they are partnering directly. So this whole idea of being prime narrative or prime software provider, and they are established. Nobody claims like, no, people don't go and say, oh yeah, we use Palantir for this problem and we failed. Okay, people are unhappy for Palantir for different reasons. Okay, but nobody says that. And even like people I have mentioned several times in past, people who hate Palantir, they say, oh dude, I mean, this is too much power in somebody's hand. So when Palantir says that they are solving the biggest, the most complex problem, yeah, nobody is actually trying to copy them. Like even the companies who are trying to say, oh, we are like Palantir, even though they don't claim that they are solving these problems. They say, oh yeah, we can do it, but nobody claims that they have done it. That's very different. Very different. Back to you guys.
Yeah, I think that's how Shyam was speaking on the call as well. I mean, he was speaking, it was a lot more different than Q3 earnings. He was a lot more relaxed. Instead of like being a real cheerleader, he was just answering the questions very clearly. And the governmental business, I mean, they obviously asked them, the concerns around 90 customers in Q4, 2020, Q4 2021, not big change. And his argument was primarily, look, they haven't passed the budget. Once they pass the budget, volatility on the upside. As you said, Sachin, they are trying to solve the world's literal biggest problems, which we'll talk about in a bit with Karp's shareholder letter. And I think that's a really good point, because a lot of other companies are not claiming to solve those problems. So, it gets me excited every time when I think about my investment in Palantir, because I'm like, I'm really investing in a company that is flat out said they will become the most important software technology company in the world. And I think that the Shyam interview did a really good job at articulating why.